millions of low-income individuals are getting conflicting messages from their government, save and don't save. And this is due to the rules for the nation's public assistance programs. The goal of today's event is to address this mixed message and debate ways to reform asset limits to remove the penalty to save, and hence be able to enable more individuals to put themselves on a path to financial independence. The wide support for reform is apparent from the number of organizations co-hosting this event today. I would like to thank AARP, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, CFPD, National Disability Institute, the Retirement Security Project, Sergeant Shriver National Center on Poverty Law, and World Institute on Disabilities for partnering with us. And we're hosting today's event in association with the Savings and Ownership Caucus, which has the mission to explore and debate policies to build savings and assets for all Americans, especially low-income Americans. The co-chairs of this bicameral bipartisan caucus are Senator Conrad, Representatives Cooper, English, Petra, and Pomeroy. Representative Cooper had a major role in the formation and the success of the Savings and Ownership Caucus. As you know, he is a House Representative from Tennessee. He serves on 3 different committees: the Armed Services Committee, the Budget Committee, and the Government Reform and Oversight Committee. He is also a member of the Blue Dog Coalition. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Cooper.
So much, Bruno. We appreciate the New American Foundation and all the other groups. It's quite a remarkable list that are co-hosting this opportunity to lunch and learn. This is a really important topic because even though a lot of folks focus on savings and ownership, a lot of folks tend to overlook the poorest among us. I learned something myself today. If you read the report by Peter Orzog and his co-authors from the Retirement Security Project, you learn the people in America who pay the highest tax on savings are the poorest of the poor. And it comes in disguise. It comes in the form of an asset test. Now, there are opportunities to change this. In fact, it's my understanding in the Farm Bill that's about to come to the House floor, we will reduce or eliminate the asset caps for a number of programs. But a lot more can be done. I had hoped to have the opportunity today to welcome the newest member of the Savings and Ownership Caucus, Congressman John Conyers, a 21-term member of the House of Representatives, who's legendary in many respects, but we welcome his support to broaden our coalition and to increase the awareness of the need for all Americans, young and old, rich and poor, to save money to prepare for the future. Oh, here's perfect timing. I was just in mid-rhapsody. No, I just walked to John as the newest member of the Savings and Ownership Caucus. He has some truly bold legislation to eliminate asset caps across a number of very important federal programs. So this is an exciting opportunity for us to try to boost the national savings rate. It's going to take all of us to do it because that savings rate has been 0 or negative for the last couple of years. That's something we did not even see during the Great Depression. So this is a vitally important mission. It has to do with each individual. It also has to do with America because we have never seen dissaving to this extent. So it's my understanding that Congresswoman Woolsey has a representative here as well. That's another sign of the breadth of the coalition here. I think this is truly an exciting time because working together, we can change not only federal dissaving, hopefully we can affect individual dissaving behavior. So without further ado, I'd like to bring forward one of the most famous, most senior, most learned members of the House, who's also involved in his own controversy with the administration at this point, having issued, what, 2 subpoenas yesterday?
Thank you, Jim, and good afternoon, my dear friends. Happy to see so many people out. This is getting serious. Actually, we issued 2 contempt of Congress for violating the subpoenas we had issued before. And there's more to come. Unfortunately, things keep happening around here in this 110th session to the degree that I can't really get to my real agenda for dealing with all the derelictions of constitutional responsibility that keep coming to the Judiciary Committee. But this is an exciting moment in time. We've got a relatively new organization that's coming together with almost a dozen members right off the bat to deal with this great new bill that we have that will give thousands of low-income Americans the right to save for their future. Now, it's kind of ironic that this fits into a bigger pattern. This means testing idea, to me, is a very obnoxious one. I first ran into it when we were rewriting the bankruptcy code, and they started means testing people to go, individuals to go into bankruptcy. And when you got through with that, you were really in the soup for a long time. And so I'm for anything that would make this thing a little bit more responsible, a little bit more, a little bit less demeaning, and that we really look at this problem. And so I'm happy to join you in taking away the assets tests from these three very large pieces of legislation. But it gives me a chance to talk about this matter in a larger frame. You see, in Michigan, among the automobile manufacturers, we have this unusual phenomenon that I'm in the process of trying to trace and understand, where people join into negotiation over wages and working conditions, pensions and benefits, health care, and then the next year the side with the most lawyers come back and say, oops, you know, we're really having a difficult time this year. And so guess what? Remember that contract that we fought over like cats and dogs? Well, we're going to have to go back and open it up, and you're going to have to give up some pension benefits, some health care benefits. And by the way, we're moving a lot of our manufacturing bases out of Detroit. Sorry about that. We're going to move them out of the country, as a matter of fact. And I keep trying to say, now what brought this on? Have you ever been able to sign a contract and then come back and say, well, we made a mistake and we got to do it over again? Well, the lawyer on the other side would begin smiling, if not laughing outright. And we're not going to do anything again. That's why we signed the contract, remember? And so we have this destabilization that's going on among working people in many ways. And the people on the bottom, of course, usually get the worst deals. And here we are talking about low-income Americans really getting the worst deal here. So this is this effort that we're starting off with, this caucus, is part of a larger consideration of the economic structure for working people in America. And why I'm proud of you is that it starts us off with the least of these. I guess there may be some even more least of these than the ones we're dealing with, because there are some people that can't even qualify for temporary assistance for needy families, some that can't qualify for supplemental security income, some that can't. We're hoping we'll reach everybody through the S-CHIP program. But we're talking about an America that's going through a very traumatic period. And I like getting in on this at the bottom with you. I've got a number of organizations, and you probably know about others as well, that can join in on this and make the movement around this legislation a basis for us re-examining where our economic system, Jim, is going. And most of my indicia is that it's going down. Things are getting worse. And I conclude with pointing to the ostensible enemy, globalization. Well, let's globalize everything, which I guess there's good globalization and bad globalization. But the thing that gets me is that most of the people that produce and manufacture goods in America are looking for the places where the labor is the cheapest, where the costs are the most inexpensive, where they can get away with most, and I blame it on the trade laws. NAFTA, CAFTA, and all these things that keep coming down the pipe, enticing and encouraging people that just look at the bottom line to let's get the heck out of America. I mean, we're all global now, Conyers. This is the 21st century. Everything's global. And therein lies a big problem for a lot of us who are still old-fashioned enough to be talking about a full employment society. Remember that? And talking about jobs that do less than demean people and make them mere, they just become people that are in there working, and now it's not just unskilled people. There are a lot of cheap, unsatisfying, boring, professional jobs now, because these guys are all figuring out ways to make this stuff as mechanistic, as more productive, and the human element of this is being too often overlooked. So for all those secret reasons that I've unburdened on you now, I'm very, very happy to let, as you all know, we introduced the bill yesterday, and I think it's going to provide a very, very important opportunity for a lot of people in our country who sometimes wonder, what on earth are all those folks in the Beltway doing? I mean, it's all very arcane and you need 60 votes to cut off debate, and it goes on and on. And this is a very simplistic, honest response. And I will be holding a town hall meeting on this in Detroit during the recess. And we want to add that to our other town hall meetings and bring in a lot of people to get this going. I commend the caucus, I commend Congressman Cooper and the 8 other people that are on it. We only need 210 more and we'll be all set. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman Conyers, for joining us today and for your leadership on this issue. So now we're going to go ahead and get started and kind of move into a little more of a policy discussion. First, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Rourke O'Brien, and I'm a policy analyst with the Asset Building Program at New America Foundation. Our work focuses on research and design of public policies aimed at helping low and moderate income Americans save, build wealth, and invest in the future. We're here today, however, to discuss the need to reform asset limits, a feature of our nation's public assistance programs that actively discourages savings by low-income Americans. So what are asset limits? Asset limits are used in eligibility screening for all forms of public assistance, be it food stamps, TANF, SSI, and Medicaid. While the rules and limits differ between programs, the intent of the rules is the same: to ensure that recipients of our nation's public assistance programs are both income and asset poor. That is, they possess little or no savings. At first glance, such a filter makes sense. No one wants limited public funds going to assist families with hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank. Yet on the ground, these policies are having the perverse effect of telling hardworking families that while we promote and expect self-sufficiency, saving is penalized. Most would agree that we need to protect income support programs and taxpayer dollars from fraud, but existing asset limits are either far too restrictive or in some cases entirely unnecessary. Take TANF, for example. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program requires all recipients to meet stringent income requirements, engage in 30 to 40 hours a week of work activities, and be subject to strict time limits, all for rather meager cash assistance. Coupled with the stigma and hassle associated with welfare, it's easy to see why asset limits have become entirely unnecessary in preventing fraud post-welfare reform. And as an example, in 2003, less than 0.5% of all applicants were denied assistance due to the asset limit in Virginia. Unfortunately, however, these rules are proving to be more than just benign anachronisms. They can actively discourage saving and disincentivize positive economic behavior. It is understood that the climb from poverty to self-sufficiency can be fraught with unpredictable and expensive complications such as illness, temporary unemployment, or divorce. These complications can act as a riptide, dragging the working family right back to government assistance. One of the proven ways to weather these inevitable income shocks is to develop a personal safety net of saving. But under today's rules, in order to remain eligible for government assistance we all understand is vital to the path to economic independence, families aren't permitted to save much at all. Under current rules, any money that families might have saved from years of hard work in low-wage jobs must be spent before applying for government assistance. Consider the case of a working mother who, after years of being told about the importance of saving for retirement, has managed to save $5,000 in an IRA. In the unfortunate event that this mother loses her job, the only way her family could qualify for food stamp assistance is if she spends down the money in her IRA. At once, we are telling this woman she needs to plan long-term and save for retirement because Social Security won't be enough. Yet at the same time, we tell her she'll need to liquidate her savings if she needs to receive temporary government assistance. This is clearly not the message we want to be sending working families. In addition to providing an active disincentive to save, asset limits place an unnecessary administrative burden on social service offices. Caseworkers are required to spend countless man-hours every day verifying that these very low-income families are indeed asset poor. States that have used their limited authority to eliminate or raise the asset test in some of these programs have reported significant administrative savings without jumping caseload. The bottom line is that current asset limits are punitive, overly restrictive, and in some cases entirely unnecessary. The need for reforming is clear, and that's what brings us here today. We would like to thank AARP, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, CFED, the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law, the National Disability Institute, the Retirement Security Project, and the World Institute on Disabilities for co-hosting this event with the New America Foundation. Years of research and advocacy by these and other groups have brought this issue to light here in DC and in state capitals across the country. This afternoon, we'll have the opportunity to hear from 5 individuals engaged in the asset limits debate. Each has a different focus and approaches the topic from a different angle, from education and retirement savings to the impact of asset limits on the disability community. First, we'll be hearing from Zoe Newberger, a senior policy analyst at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Zoe will provide us with more specifics about asset limit policy and also share some current avenues for reform at the federal level. Following Zoe, we will hear from Carol Wayman, Senior Legislative Director at CFED, who will be discussing the link between asset limits and saving for higher education. Then we will hear from Phyllis Stinson, Director of External Relations from the Retirement Security Project, who will address the impact of asset limits on retirement savings. Following Phyllis, we have Dory Rand, who is the Supervising Attorney of the Community Investment Unit at the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law, and she will share with us the growing momentum for asset limit reform that's taking place at the state level. And also, out on the handout table, I don't know if you saw, but Dory has a very excellent article kind of profiling what's been happening state by state and some of the politics and policy around that. So I highly recommend you pick that up. And after Dory, we'll be hearing from Steve Mendelson, an attorney and disability rights advocate with the University of Iowa Law School Law, Health, Policy, and Disability Center's Asset Accumulation and Tax Policy Project. He will be speaking on the specific need for reform of asset limits in the SSI program and the impact of asset limits on the disability community. We hope to keep our remarks brief so that we have some time to end for question and answer. So with that, I'd like to introduce Zoe Newberger.
Sorry to interrupt the panel, but we've been honored to be joined by Congresswoman Moore right now, actually. So she would like to share her brief remarks. And Congresswoman Moore is a House representative from 4th District of Wisconsin. She serves on 3 different committees: the Financial Services Committee, Small Business Committee, and the Budget Committee. And I also like to inform that I'm very fond of where she represents because I lived in Milwaukee for quite a few years, and I'm also an alumni of the Marquette University. So please join me in welcoming Congresswoman Moore.
Good morning. I had to hug her because you never know when you need one of those absentee votes. It is so good to be here today. You know, part of my vita that she didn't share with you is that I raised 3 children in welfare. And I was a welfare recipient as a child as well, 8th of 9 children, where we relied upon public assistance in order to survive. I can remember being on welfare as a child and not being allowed to have a telephone in order to receive public assistance. And it was only after my mother suffered a major heart attack, aorta failure, that we were allowed a waiver to have a telephone because of her health conditions. I think that some of the class warfare, and I'm from Wisconsin, the first state that ended public assistance to poor women, poor children, and became the model for Frankenstein's, it was Frankenstein's laboratory for welfare reform. I can tell you as a former welfare recipient, it is why we have the class warfare against poor women and children. It is because we have basically frozen out decent people who have run into hard times, who need the collective community support, need food stamps, need health care. We have crowded them out of help because we have demanded that they come crawling on their bellies and that they hit rock bottom and have nothing, don't have a house, don't have a car, don't have pension savings before we will help them. And we have created this class warfare because we don't help deserving Americans who need the body politic to help them. When I think back to Katrina those folks on the rooftops with signs, help us, help us. I'm thinking that a car could have saved them. But for the fact that in our stinginess, a car of a certain value would have been seen as an asset and would have crowded you out from getting certain benefits. That is why in the Congressional Black Caucus Hurricane Benefit Package, I put a provision in that relieved this asset test. I want to applaud this foundation for the tremendous work that they're doing, for creating the political will to once again make us Americans and to reach out to those people who are in need and not force them into the bowels of abject poverty before we can say, brother, sister, we're here for you. Thank you so much for interrupting your program for my remarks. Thank you.
So now to get to some more nuts and bolts type of information. But I'm going to try to do two things very briefly. First, provide a general overview regarding the asset rules and some of the major means-tested programs, and then focus a little bit more in detail on the food stamp program because there are some very exciting legislative proposals in the works there. Now, probably the one piece of information you'll come away with is the key point is that the asset rules in public benefit programs are incredibly complicated. I could probably spend 3 hours trying to explain them. I'm going to spend about 3 minutes, so you'll get the broad contours. Let me just start with an example. If you're a low-income parent with a child who's been working and has managed to save $3,500 in a 401k for your employer, if you were living in the state of South Dakota, that 401k plan would disqualify you from receiving Medicaid, even if you would otherwise qualify based on your income and other family circumstances. If you lived in the state of North Dakota, that wouldn't be the case. You've got a disparity there. Likewise, that 401k would not affect your eligibility for food stamps, but if you were unfortunate enough to lose your job, roll it over into an IRA, which is a very typical and recommended practice, that IRA would prevent you from getting food stamps. So those are just a few illustrations of the complexity and confusion. You can imagine why people might conclude when they start to learn about asset rules that, why bother saving if the first time I need any help, I'm just going to have to spend down everything I've managed to put away. And it's not going to be there for me in the long run. What those examples show are that there are 3 main factors that determine how a particular savings account that you've got will affect your eligibility. What state you live in, what program you're applying for, and the particular savings vehicle that you've chosen. I'm going to go through briefly 4 of the large means-tested programs and just give you kind of the lay of the land and how they work. I'll start with the Supplemental Security Income Program, or SSI, and I know there'll be more discussion on this program later. That program provides cash assistance to extremely poor individuals who have disabilities or are elderly. That's the classic example of a program where the rules are set at the federal level. There are federal asset limits of $2,000 for an individual, $3,000 for a couple. States do not have flexibility within those, and the rules are very strict about what counts as an asset. At the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of flexibility are the Medicaid program and the TANF cash assistance program. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the acronym, TANF cash assistance is essentially welfare payments that replace the old AFTC program. In the TANF program, states have, and in Medicaid as well, states have complete flexibility with regard to where they set the asset limit and what they count toward that limit. In TANF, most states have retained an asset limit, all but 2 states, in fact, and most of those limits are in the $2,000 to $3,000 range as well. In Medicaid, there's actually quite a different story. States have utilized their flexibility and made a lot of changes to the asset rules. In programs that provide Medicaid to children specifically, almost every single state has eliminated the asset test entirely. In the eligibility categories for pregnant women, most states have eliminated the asset test. And nearly half the states have eliminated the asset test for parents of children as well. Medicaid also serves, as I'm sure you're aware, people with disabilities and seniors, and states generally have retained asset tests for those populations, and they again tend to be in the $2,000 to $3,000 range. Now, the food stamp program sort of lies in the middle of the spectrum as far as flexibility goes. There are federal asset rules. Again, you have an asset limit of $2,000 per family. It goes up to $3,000 if the family has a member who's elderly or disabled. But states do have some flexibility within federal parameters to liberalize those asset rules. I'm not going to go into the detail of how that works, but there are some opportunities already there. But we think it's important to pay attention to the federal limit because that is the default policy in many states. That limit has not been adjusted for inflation. It's been in place for about 20 years. If it had kept pace with inflation, families would be able to save about twice as much as they can save under the current frozen rules. And the good news is that, as I'm sure most of you are aware, the program is being reauthorized right now. And there's widespread interest and consensus on making some positive improvements in the asset limit. There's remarkable bipartisan agreement on the kinds of changes that would be beneficial. The House Agriculture Committee's Farm Bill that's being considered on the floor momentarily, I understand, has two important asset limit changes. The first is that asset limits would be indexed to inflation, starting from this point forward. And the second change is that two specific kinds of savings, retirement savings and education savings, would be precluded from counting as assets. And I know other speakers will talk about the importance of those specific kinds of savings and why they're singled out. There's an alternative to the Farm Bill, a so-called reform, or that's referred to as a reform bill, that also has the same provisions with regard to assets. So again, those two provisions are very widely in consideration. And on the Senate side, Senators Chambliss and Harkin, who are the ranking members and chair, respectively, of the Senate Agriculture Committee, have introduced a bill that has those exact same changes to the asset limit as well. There's also interest, and this provision is included in Representative Conyers' bill that was just introduced, in going a little bit further and actually raising the asset limit before indexing it for inflation. Our sense is that there is widespread support for that kind of change as well. It's a costly change in the context of the bills that are under consideration, and that's why there's been, it hasn't been included in as many of the pieces of legislation. So the good news is lots of consensus and lots of possibility to get something done. It seems as though whether these changes are actually made at this point will all depend on whether funding is found to pay for the costs associated, because obviously by making some people eligible for benefits that wouldn't otherwise have gotten them, there are costs attached. So I will stop there. If people want more detail later, I'd be happy to get into it.
Thank you, Zoe. It's a pleasure to follow the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and Congresswoman Moore and Congressman Cooper, who've been such champions on these issues for so many years. This afternoon, I wanted to share Corporation for Enterprise Development's experience with asset limits and how it impacts children's savings. CFED is a national nonprofit organization. We are nonpartisan, and we work to expand economic opportunity by finding good ideas, testing what works in communities, and then trying to bring it to scale through policy and more market innovation. We've been very successful with savings for adults. We're the ones who pioneered and tested the individual development accounts, match savings accounts for adults that targeted low-income adults, provided them financial education, and then matched their individual savings to help them buy a home, start a business, or pursue post-secondary education or college training. And across the country now, we have about 540 programs we work with, assisting 50,000 savers, and these accounts have been transformational. Adding an asset component to income support programs really makes people able to think about their future in a way that they're not able to with income support alone. So we wanted to test this savings hypothesis for children. We're running a 5-year demonstration program entitled SEED, Savings for Education, Entrepreneurship, and Development. We're in 12 communities, which are featured here in this brochure on the table. And we're studying to see if the presence of a matched savings account for children actually changes the way the kids think about themselves and the way the parents plan for a child's life outcomes. We've recruited about a dozen local partners who have brought in 1,400 children. We have found kids at Head Start centers, at Boys and Girls Clubs, elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, the Cherokee Nation, And with funding from national foundations, we've been able to seed these initial accounts with cash. And we've been able to provide matches for whatever the children or the parents are able to put in. We put in benchmark incentives, so if the children do well in school, they might get an additional $25. If they complete a financial education course, they might get an additional $25. And then, of course, we provide the financial education. And Dora is one of our specific grantees, and she'll talk about her experience. Well, how are the savers doing? Well, they've saved and accumulated $1.47 million. So this $1.5 million works out to about $1,100 per child. Now, who are these savers? Half of these children live in households who earn less than the poverty line. So you're looking at about $18,000 in annual income for a family of 4. 44% of the caregivers have less than a high school education. And 78% are children of color. About half, 50%, are African American children, which is consistent with the racial wealth gap that we know is persistent in this country. CFPB's research has found that for every dollar in wealth a white household has, a minority household has just 6 cents. This is a legacy of past racial discrimination and policy writ large. So as you would expect, this population of 1,400 children in our savings demonstration has a strong intersection with asset limits. 38% of the households receive food stamps, 11% receive TANF. And how did we deal with this? Well, we had to make a targeted effort in each of the 12 states. We had to find the right belly button to push. We had to find the right person for each agency to get them to give us an independent waiver for the seed accounts. Or we had to structure the accounts in a certain way so that the children and their families didn't own the account themselves. Well, our part of the demonstration is drawing to a close. It's a 5-year demonstration, and yet 72% of the children are between ages 3 and 9. The vast majority want to save for college. There's a number of ways you save for college. As you know, you've got 529s, either a prepaid tuition or a standard 529. You have a Coverdell account. You can save in an IRA. You can save in a Roth IRA, or you can save in a non-tax preferred account. Well, we want to help these children roll this money over into a standard account. Except once you do that, you run into asset limits of $2,000 or more. If you've got that, and it depends on the state you're in, the child will have to pay penalties on that account. That money then gets liquidated, and the child's lost their plan for attending college for low-income children. This, to us, is just a tragedy. The problem is also compounded by growing interest at the state level to match family contributions to 529s. We've worked with 9 states who are currently matching individual and family deposits into 529s for low-income children in an effort to promote education and college achievement for low-income kids. Now, time doesn't enable me today to discuss how assets affect financial aid for college, but I do have a little brochure on the table that explains how financial aid impacts with children's savings accounts. I'd like to close with a quote from Najee. She's a quite precocious Philadelphian who says, "Before I joined the SEED program, I was just an 11-year-old 5th grader, soon to be 6th grader. But unlike half the rest of 11-year-old 5th graders, I had a vision for my future. My vision is to finish high school and go on to college and become a successful African-American female. I had a vision, but not a clear path to get there. Now with my seed savings account, I have the vision and a way to get there." Now, bank accounts are not just accounts. They're hope made tangible. So Congress can make 4 changes to stop discouraging savings by low-income families and not penalizing children who set up accounts for their future only to watch them be depleted if there's a divorce or a healthcare emergency or a loss of a job. Can raise the asset limits, as Zoe mentioned, index those limits to inflation, exempt college savings accounts such as 529s and Coverdells from eligibility, and we can provide a match. The importance of a match to encouraging people to save is well documented. The Savers Credit does not currently match 529s or Coverdells, so we'd like the Savers Credit to be extended and also to make it refundable to reach low-income children. In closing, there are many complex, wicked problems that you are working to solve. Updating asset limits isn't one of them. Simple changes to public benefits programs and the tax code will ensure that efforts at the local, state, and federal level to help children plan for their future will not result in negative consequences when a family hits a financial rough patch. We know that savings, if started at a young age, can break the cycle of intergenerational poverty by expanding children's dreams and opportunities.
Good afternoon, I'm Dory Rand from the Shriver Center. The Shriver Center is a national law and policy center based in Chicago that takes action to end poverty through policy advocacy, litigation, communications, and model programs such as the SEED initiative that we partner with CFPB on. What I'd like to do today is share with you some of the efforts that have been going on at the state level to reform asset limits. And I think that they can help allay some of the concerns that you and our elected officials might have about the impact of doing that. When the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act was passed in 1996, it gave states the authority to set their own rules for the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Cash Assistance Program. And that included the authority to have no asset limits whatsoever. But as Zoe said, only 2 states have taken advantage of their full authority so far. Ohio was the first state to do this in 1997 as part of a broad welfare reform effort. And it was actually one of its most conservative members of the House who suggested eliminating asset limits. And he and his colleagues saw that the new emphasis on work and the tough work requirements and so on really made asset limits unnecessary and counterproductive. And so Ohio eliminated the asset test in TANF back in 1997, and contrary to what the budget analysts predicted would be a caseload increase, they saw no such caseload increase. They had no political fallout over this, and it's been fine ever since. A few years later, Virginia, through administrative rulemaking, the Department of Social Services and the State Board passed administrative rules also to completely eliminate the asset test in TANF. And again, the budget analysts predicted that there would be a caseload increase and this would be costly for the state. But despite that, the state went ahead and eliminated the asset test and saw no significant caseload increase over the many years since then. And in fact, Ohio received TANF bonuses for its caseload reduction and workforce involvement. And what both states agreed was an important factor in changing the asset test was the huge administrative burden of applying the test. We know from CFPB's Assets and Opportunities Scorecard and other information that most low-income people have no assets anyway, and yet all the caseworkers were spending time asking questions and requiring documentation about everybody's assets, wasting hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in staff time that could have been put to better use. So Ohio and Virginia recognized that this ultimately was a cost savings to change this rule. Illinois has been somewhat successful in implementing some asset limit reform, but unfortunately they did not go through with passing some proposed rules a couple years ago that would have eliminated the asset test in cash assistance and eliminated the vehicle test in food stamps. But we did make some other changes as part of a financial education and individual development account program that we administered years ago. The department agreed to expand the exemption for all individual development account programs approved by the department, not just the narrower category of ones excluded under the Federal Assets for Independence Act. And we also excluded all kinds of retirement accounts. Not just the traditional pension plans, but IRAs, 401ks, KEOs, and so on. And we did that for both cash assistance and the food stamp program. But at this time, we don't have an exemption for college savings plans. And our children who are participating in the SEED initiative, we have over 60 kids in elementary school in Chicago who collectively have saved over $50,000 over the last 3 years for college savings, and each of them have saved maybe $1,500. That'll be matched by $1,500, and if their family is receiving TANF or food stamps or SSI, when we roll over those accounts and change it from the Shriver Center's ownership to the family's ownership, that could make them ineligible. So we're still working very hard to get that change at the state level. We were also the first state to count financial education as a TANF work activity, and now Delaware, California, some other states have done that, and the department is actively referring recipients of TANF and food stamps to programs to learn about saving and building wealth. And what we found through an evaluation of this program was that the knowledge levels were quite low about what assets you can have and how much. But as a result of completing the financial education course, people then started opening accounts and saving more and building assets. So it really does work if you send the right message. Last year, California and Colorado were the next states to introduce bills to completely eliminate the asset test in TANF cash assistance. Unfortunately, it didn't pass as proposed, but compromises were made, and eventually both states exempted several categories of assets, and Colorado also raised the asset limit in TANF from $2,000 to $15,000. So that's significant. It sounds like a lot of money, but when you think about what if somebody saved just $2,500 a year in an IRA, maybe they work from the age of 25 to 40, they've got about $50,000 in savings, they become unemployed, they need cash assistance. Should they be having to spend all of that down, deplete their resources, pay penalties on those funds just to be eligible for temporary assistance for a couple years till they get back on their feet? So even though I commend our colleagues in Colorado and California for trying to raise the limits, at the same time I think even 15 or 20,000 isn't that much. It needs to be significantly higher, or better yet, just eliminated altogether. So these are promising developments, but even if the states use the full extent of their authority to reform asset limits in the programs that the state has control over, families will continue to be discouraged from savings. And if someone in their family receives SSI, for example, even if the state has eliminated the asset test in TANF and use the rules available to make everyone eligible for food stamps who receives a TANF benefit under categorical eligibility, they're still going to be precluded by that lowest asset limit of $2,000 in the SSI program from saving. So that's why it's so important that we work on this at the federal level as well. And the Shriver Center strongly supports the efforts that we heard about here today, the Freedom to Save Act, the Farm Bill, and other efforts to make it possible for everyone, including our most vulnerable populations, to save more. I want to conclude by just saying that the Shriver Center is developing a state asset limit toolkit with information about what all the other states have done and some sample legislative language and talking points that we would be happy to make available to you who are working at the state level. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Phyllis Stinson. I'm the Director of External Relations with the Retirement Security Project, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how retirement accounts are treated in the asset test and what some of the problems those applying for means-tested programs encounter. First, I want to give a little background on who RSP is. We are supported by the Pew Charitable Trusts in partnership with the Brookings Institution and Georgetown University. We have 3 principals, 2 from Brookings and 1 from the Heritage Foundation. With senior staff from both Brookings and Heritage, our initiatives and policy proposals really do cross ideologies. I give you that background first because no one can ever quite figure out who or what RSP is, and second, to give you an idea of just how much the issue of retirement security, asset building, and saving crosses party lines. These are issues where both sides can really work together. That said, the primary issue with the treatment of retirement accounts as regards asset tests is the type of retirement account that you have. Defined benefit plans, aka traditional pension plans, where an employer puts money away for you and distributes it to you upon retiring, or a defined contribution, also more commonly known as 401k or an IRA, where the employee puts his or her own money away and then gets it back upon retirement. The past 25 years have brought a dramatic shift in our nation's pension system, away from defined benefit plans and toward defined contribution plans. Unfortunately, many of our public policies have not been updated to reflect the increased responsibility that has been placed on individuals to prepare for their own retirement. So when asset tests were written more than a quarter of a century ago, more workers participated in defined benefit pension plans than in defined contribution 401k type plans. But that has changed significantly. Between 1984 and 1991, for example, the share of families with earnings between $10,000 and $20,000, that's in 1991 dollars, who participated in a 401k rose from 3% to 14%. Asset tests for food stamps, SSI, Medicaid, and cash welfare exclude funds in defined benefit plans when determining eligibility, while at the same time they include savings accrued in 401ks and or IRAs. This really depends on the program, and so as a result, some families are forced to choose between the temporary assistance they need today and the retirement security they need tomorrow. There are two main issues with the way asset limits are currently set up. The first one, in many programs, the asset limit is set, as people here said, at $2,000 for an individual or $3,000 for a couple. This is significantly lower than what most people will need during their retirement years. Individuals are forced to spend down long-term savings to qualify for short-term assistance. Again, this has been said by others here on the panel. This leaves them more vulnerable in the future and can make it more likely that they will need public assistance during their retirement years too. The other issue is that asset tests, as Representative Cooper said when he spoke, asset tests create an implicit tax on saving. The 10% penalty that you pay for early withdrawal and the taxes that you owe on amounts that you withdraw become, in effect, a very high tax on saving for moderate and low-income individuals. This can serve as to discourage saving in the first place, especially among working individuals whose incomes are just above the threshold, but fear their incomes may fall in the future, forcing them to seek short-term assistance. Why save for the long term if you think that you might at some point need some help? These decisions are made all the time, and you would have to, if you have to deplete your the savings that you've accrued, paying taxes and penalties in order to get the help you need today. The good news is that there are a lot of you here today. This is on many people's radar screen. Several policymakers have introduced legislation to exclude the balances in all qualified retirement accounts from the asset test for certain means-tested programs. Republicans, Democrats, senators, and House members. It was in the administration's budget proposal for the food stamp program this year. People are trying to do something about it. RSP is interested in seeing this policy change occur for all federal means-tested programs, SSI, Medicaid, food stamps, etc. But we've been focused recently on changes to the food stamp program since the Farm Bill has been moving forward, sort of. As I've said, this is a bipartisan, cross-ideological issue. In May, RSP sponsored an event to highlight the issue within the food stamp program. It was held at the Heritage Foundation. Senator Saxby Chambliss, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and a representative from the administration all spoke about the need for excluding all qualified retirement accounts from the asset test. The most important person at the event, though, was a woman from upstate New York who had been denied food stamps. She graciously agreed to come to DC to tell her story. Linda George started saving money for her retirement 20 years ago, first as a substitute teacher and then as a factory worker. She worked for 14 years and contributed to 401ks in both jobs. After her first child was born, she decided to stay at home to raise him and help her husband run their family's dairy farm. The company she worked for sent her a check from her 401k since she was no longer an employee. In order not to pay taxes and heavy penalties, she rolled the money into an IRA at her bank. Linda did everything we are told to do to save for her own retirement. She started young, she saved a little every paycheck, and she rolled the account over when she switched jobs instead of taking a lump sum. 6 years later, milk prices plummeted and the dairy farm is struggling. Their income last year was less than $11,000, and they needed some help. When she went to apply for food stamps, she was surprised to find out that her IRA savings had made her ineligible. She was income eligible, asset ineligible. What surprised her even more, though, was that had she kept her money in her former company's 401k, she would have been eligible for food stamps. 2 qualified retirement accounts, 2 radically different outcomes for Linda. she ended up having to cash out one of her IRAs, paying significant penalties and taxes to buy groceries. This just doesn't make sense. Eligibility for means-tested benefits should not depend on the form of retirement account a worker's employer has offered. We need to bring asset tests into the 21st century. They must reflect the changes in how Americans save for retirement that have taken place over the last 25 years. It's counterproductive to force people to deplete long-term savings today at the expense of a more secure retirement later. I brought 2 papers released by RSP on this issue. They're out on the table. One is a state-by-state analysis of the asset test rules' effect on retirement saving. And the other is a policy brief for a longer paper written by CBPP and released by RSP. If anyone, this is 8 pages, if anyone wants the full 50 glorious pages, I'd be happy to email it to you, or you could go to our website. And with that, I will hand over to Steve.
Thank you, Phyllis, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor to be here today. I think we all feel that we are present at and participating in the beginning of something tremendously portentous and important. I wanted to add some of the specifics which are already set out in the documents we put on the table regarding some of the particular impacts of and implications of asset limitations for people with disabilities. But since that's already written down, I'd like first to say a few other things which are presaged and suggested by the remarks that have preceded me. First of all, I want to suggest something that I think we all know, which is that as cruel as is the victimization of people in lower income brackets, and as horrifying as is the tax represented by asset limits, there's even a bigger victim of asset limits. The biggest victim of asset limits is the taxpayer, is the public. Because in the long run, asset limits cost the public vast amounts of money that could be saved and used far more productively. Second, as a person who has some knowledge of the tax law and done a lot of work in tax law, I can confirm what probably, again, all of you know intuitively, which is that the rules governing the asset limitations and the various programs we've discussed here today are infinitely more complex than the rules governing the tax deductibility of income and other tax-related issues. None of us would dare to make a tax decision without consulting either an accountant, a CPA, or even a tax preparation program or a book or something like that. And yet we ask poor people who have relatively little access to the kinds of expert resources that would be comparable to make incredibly important decisions, irrevocably important decisions about their lives in the context of programs which are so complex that often nobody knows the answer, even if the questions were asked. The result of that is, of course, that people are fearful. Even people who would like to try to save to the extent that they could, to earn to the extent that they could, to build resources to the extent that they could, are discouraged from doing so because the fear of failure, the fear of punitive consequences, the fear of being worse off is at least as great and sometimes greater than the actual result, and we know the actual result is bad enough. So there's this. Also, I think it's important to remember that we don't have a lot of time here. We know that the resources available for, and very frankly, the resentment about the growth of entitlement programs and the growth of dependency is very great and has political effects. We also know that we haven't done a very good job as a society in creating pathways for upward mobility or means for self-sufficiency that people of low and moderate income can reach. We haven't done it through employment, entry-level employment, even when available is no longer a means to upward mobility the way it was a generation or two ago for reasons which Chairman Conyers has suggested. That being the case, we find ourselves in a dilemma. What are we going to do? We're not prepared to sustain dependency indefinitely, and we're not able to generate upward mobility through the traditional means. So what options do we have? Asset accumulation is the only option. There doesn't seem to be another one. And that leads to the further conclusion, which is that the burden of proof in this debate is not on us. The burden of proof is on those who would maintain the status quo. to prove that it's doing any good, that it's serving any valid social purpose. And if further proof that it's not serving any valid social purpose were necessary, we don't only need to look at how we make the arguments in respect of what we call the middle class and what we call the wealthier elements of our society. No one would ever suggest, in the context of tax policy for the better off, that the kinds of values which seem to be enshrined in our asset limitations would make sense from the standpoint of even a minimal understanding of human nature or human motivation if applied in those other contexts. So we have really an incredible double standard. We have apparently, at least as embodied in our laws, whole different assumptions about human nature based on the economic level. And I'm reminded of what John Kenneth Galbraith, the late John Kenneth Galbraith said. He said, there are people who seem to think that the rich won't work because they have too little, and the poor won't work because they have too much. And I think old Galbraith understood it pretty well. I know I don't have much time left, in more ways than one, but let me suggest very briefly, specifically with respect to the disability population, who I am here to talk about today. I wouldn't presume to speak for anyone, but I certainly can speak from a measure of experience, a great deal of consultation and shared discussion. Very specifically, the issue for people with disabilities is almost a double or nothing situation, because here you're dealing not merely with income support, not merely with retirement savings, but also with health insurance. Because Medicaid, through the context of SSI and otherwise, is very critical in the lives of many people with disabilities who have even more difficulty than the average person. I mean, I don't know how much difficulty the average person is, but who have even more difficulty than the average person getting health insurance in the private sector, and who therefore are dependent upon Medicaid for insurance to a large degree, who risk Medicaid in the balance of asset limitations when they try to work or save. So that creates a double or nothing situation. We're also faced with the fact that for many people with disabilities, programs like SSI are not temporary. Regrettably, they're permanent. And that gives rise to the economic argument, which is that given the baseline cost of continued dependency, and given the currently low numbers of people who once on the benefit rolls are able to leave, or certainly who are able to leave permanently, the incremental costs to taxpayers of asset limitation easing or even asset limitation elimination would be small. And I think this is an important point to remember in all the programs. You have to begin with the baseline costs. If you look at what the baseline costs are and define the baseline costs realistically to include all the ancillary costs of the asset limitations, then the costs of the kinds of experiments, the kinds of efforts, the kinds of innovations that we're talking about are incrementally not really very great at all, and can be offset in many cases by very plausible forecasts of savings. Unfortunately, the forecasts of savings tend to occur most in what are called the out years, because people will become self-sufficient and independent over a course of years. And we don't have a scoring system in the budgetary process through CBO and through OMB, as I'm sure most of you know. We don't have a scoring system which really allows us to take those future, not hypothetical, not pie in the sky, not airy-fairy, but future savings into account in the scoring and the costing out of the cost and benefits of various budgetary and substantive proposals with economic implications. So we need to work on developing a scoring process which is responsive to the real needs of today. And we need to work on a process which recognizes that human nature is not a function of economic level or social class. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to all of our speakers for joining us today. We do want to leave a few minutes for you guys to offer any questions you might have. There's specifics of policy or kind of state innovations.
I'm Dave Oxter, Research Institute for Independent Living, and the good news about disability is that 2% of the people with disabilities, that's 54 million and 100 million disabled individuals, are 500% above poverty, so they can save. But on the other hand, you have 37% that are in the workforce, and of that 37%, you have 40 to 65% who are working at sub-poverty wage. That leaves us another 63% that aren't even working. And my question is, Where do those individuals with disabilities who are not in the workforce and are working at sub-poverty wages fit into the savings equation?
Well, Dave, we have some data on that. It's a very interesting work. If you pick up our documents, you'll see some reference to it. It's a very interesting work done by the IRS lately, believe it or not. And they have found that taxpayers with disabilities report an average income of $19,000 a year, whereas taxpayers reporting no disabilities reported an average income of $33,000 a year. To what extent that is a function of opportunity variation, to what extent that is a function of asset limitation, to what extent it's a function of other factors is not yet entirely parked out, but there is a tremendous difference of income even among the working poor. And there obviously is a tremendous depressive impact upon income and hence upon savings that does result from the asset limitations, because it causes people to make decisions which are against self-interest from the standpoint of any rational definition of self-interest that we would otherwise apply.
Great. Well, we're actually going to take a pause from the Q&A because we've been joined by another member. I'd like to introduce Congresswoman Lynn Woolsey. Lynn Woolsey is in her 8th term as representative from California's 6th District. Representative Woolsey serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the Committee on Science and Technology, and the Committee on Education and Labor, where she chairs the Workforce Protection Subcommittee. She joins us this afternoon as a co-sponsor of the Freedom to Save Act. Representative Woolsey.
Well, look at this great group you have. I also serve on anything and everything that John Conyers thinks is important, because he's always right. Left, really. And I'm very proud to stand here today with all of you in supporting the Freedom to Save Act. There's nothing worse than not having very much in the first place, and then the little bit you have starts being counted against you, and being elderly and vulnerable and needing to keep your life together just a little bit, well, I mean, a big bit if possible, and then to have something, your funeral expenses prepaid or your anything held against you is just not okay. And in this country, under the leadership of John Conyers, we can start turning some of this around. But we have to start understanding that poor people are not our enemy. Poor people have worked, poor elderly, fragile seniors have worked their entire lives to put food on the table for their families and hopefully for themselves and now in retirement. And to not give them every single bit of support we can give them is actually un-American. And John has this legislation now that gives us a chance to speak up to it. With your help and all of your support, we'll be able to pull it forward positively. And not just Republicans, not just Democrats, but all of us. I mean, good grief. We're all getting old. You are. But I mean, you know, we're all going to get there. Let's have some kind of path to feeling good later on in our lives, and feeling good for those people we love who are aging, and feeling good for the people who have done so much so that we can be where we are today. So I thank you, and I look forward to working with you and with John, and this is good that you're doing this today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Woolsey, for taking time to stop by and share some remarks with us. So we have about 5 minutes left. I don't know if there are other questions that... Yes.
Well, I'd just like to mention that some of the poor families that sort of get characterized in these discussions are also our most patriotic class, and really in these discussions you need to always include the military families, most of which live in this world of insane rules that apply to them but that don't apply to wealthy people who historically are the most unpatriotic class.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Cott. I'm with the Corporation for Enterprise Development. I want to thank the panel for their wonderful insight into asset limits. So my question is for Colonel Wayman. I just wanted to talk about, from what my understanding, IRAs are only used for retirement. Can you explain how they could be used for college education as well?
Thank you for the question. And IRAs and Roth IRAs, you can take out up to $10,000 for down payment assistance for a first-time home, or you can take out money for college tuition from an IRA or a Roth IRA, but you cannot do it out of a 401k or a 403b or a 457. You cannot take money out for those purposes. And if you want to know why, there's a IRS ruling, Lamar Jones versus the IRS 2005, that explains that when Congress passed the laws, a lot of this is broken out with the timing, that IRAs existed to allow these, but the 403, 4057 were not named in the legislation. So this could be a simple fix that for our purposes, most people are saving through their employer plans. So allowing those employer plans to have the same flexibility that IRAs have, we think could provide people with not just later term life choices, but shorter term home ownership and education choices.
Any other questions?
I had a question for Ms. Wayman also. We talked earlier about 529 plans and some states offering matching. Do you know offhand some other states that offer matching plans?
There's 6 states that offer full matching plans. It's Colorado, Louisiana, Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, and Rhode Island. Then Utah has a pilot program of 50 matched accounts. Arkansas has new legislation, which is also a pilot program. And Texas has new legislation that's in their prepaid tuition plan. And go ahead. Well, Oklahoma, it's not legislation. Oklahoma does have in our children's savings account demonstration, we do have 1,000 children at birth who are getting an initial deposit through seed. But that's our money. And ideally, they'll be inspired to provide their own match. But for now, they're just providing us with the paperwork of these are the newborns. We get a list of those, deposit money into their accounts, and then there's 1,000 other children, also newborns in Oklahoma, who are matched with the same race and income that we're also comparing with life outcomes. And we're doing that work with the Center for Social Development out in Washington University in St. Louis.
Any other questions? Great. Well, we would like to thank our panelists for joining us today.